I'm going to start with 4 lines from a poem. Don't worry, this video is about roguelikes and the new strategy RPG Into the Breach and how I'm having serious problems with it even though it's a really cool game. We'll get there soon, I promise. Anyway, there's this poem by Elizabeth Bishop. It's called One Art. It's one of the most famous American poems of the 20th century, and I realize we're not here to talk about poetry. Except, in this case, I think that Bishop's poem incidentally summarizes the essence of the roguelike. It's these lines in the middle of the poem. Lose something every day. Accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster. This poem was written in the mid-1970s, before there were any roguelikes, but I think it's actually a great description of the best way to play roguelikes. And I think it also explains why I'm having a lot of trouble playing Into the Breach. But before I begin, let me introduce myself and the series. I'm Patrick Holloman of the Game Design Forum, and this is, let's call it, episode 2.5 of the Game Design Extracts. It's not a full episode, but I really wanted to get this out there while Into the Breach is still a game that people feel like talking about. Anyway, back to roguelikes. The granddaddy of the roguelike genre is Rogue, which was made by a handful of college students in California in 1980. At that time, Dungeons & Dragons had taken the gaming world by storm and was just a huge freaking deal. Computer game designers were looking for ways to get the tabletop RPG onto the PC and mainframe. But this was 1980. Back then, top-of-the-line computers had 4 kilobytes of memory. Color monitors were a new thing. The CD had just made its worldwide debut. And yet, Dungeons & Dragons was a massive game. There was just no way that a real D&D campaign could ever possibly fit on a 1980 computer. I mean, heck, even modern computers can't really match the limitless possibilities of the tabletop. But I digress. Rogue attempted to solve the problem of D&D being this huge battleship of a game by stripping away everything that wasn't necessary to just sail. It got rid of towns, it got rid of NPCs, it got rid of story, it dropped characterization. It basically only allowed the player to do one thing, and that was to crawl through a dungeon, fighting monsters, and picking up loot. Now, to keep a game like that fresh, and also to save on memory resources, the designers had to rely on procedural generation. Most of you have seen this term by now, but if you haven't, procedural generation just means that every time the player character enters a new level, an algorithm creates the level, places monsters, and determines what kind of loot drops. Rogue also popularized permanent player death, a focus on hack-and-slash gameplay, super complex menus and commands, and a few other things. Games like Rogue became a new subgenre, and it was a niche genre, partly because PC RPGs weren't that popular yet, and partly because roguelikes tended to be really, really hard. Now, fast forward 32 years. It's 2012, and roguelikes are starting to come out of their niche. The world at large has been introduced to roguelike design ideas through super popular games like Diablo, which features roguelike-style procedural generation and the same hack-and-slash gameplay. The Binding of Isaac introduced a later generation to roguelike design ideas, including mandatory permadeath, and then a game called FTL came out, produced by a tiny indie outfit called Subset Games. FTL puts roguelike ideas against the sci-fi backdrop, and puts the player in the cockpit of a spaceship that is being pursued by a giant rebel fleet. The game is easy to pick up, it has cute graphics, a great premise, and people were terrible at it. No, like, people are really, really bad at FTL. There are so many videos. Anyway, FTL was a really fun game, but the reason why so many people, including me, were bad at the game was that they didn't understand the real way to play a roguelike. Back in episode 1 on the overall history of video game design, I talked a lot about how modern games are designed so that there's never a point where the player gets stuck. Modern games have regenerating health, extra lives, and all kinds of checkpoints to keep the player moving forward. Roguelikes have none of that. And even though FTL doesn't have all the core features of a roguelike, it has enough of them that many players found themselves stuck in impossible situations later in the game. Thousands of players found themselves cruising through the first few areas pretty easily, only to come to the last chapter where they got absolutely demolished by the enemies, especially the last boss. And the jump in difficulty left many of us just so salty about the whole thing. How can a game have such a needless jump in difficulty, we said. That's bad game design. But we were wrong. The moment I began to understand the real essence of roguelike gameplay was in an interview with David Brevik, one of the creators of Diablo. He told me that as a young man, he and his friends used to play classic roguelikes in the computer lab of his Cal State alma mater. A couple of the things he told me changed my perspective about what roguelikes could be. First, he explained that beating a roguelike, take Angband for example, wasn't really the point. He and his friends would play just for the excitement of getting incredibly rare drops. Also, he explained that his favorite moments in a roguelike were always right at the beginning, when he would find some unidentified scroll and then would have to use that scroll on an enemy without even knowing what it would do. He liked the sense that, in that moment, anything could happen and the game could unfold in a million different ways. Modern gamers who grew up on Final Fantasy and Mario and Call of Duty, we'd been playing roguelikes all wrong. What we failed to realize when we got obliterated by the last boss of FTL was that we didn't really die in that battle. We were already dead when we got there. Although it's easy enough to make it through all the battles that lead up to that moment, that's not enough. This is where the Elizabeth Bishop poem comes back into the story. Playing through FTL all the way to the boss, only to get demolished, is the wrong way to play the game. The right way to play is to practice losing faster. Losing after a 30-minute trip through the whole game is very annoying, but simply scrapping your game after the first couple of systems is no disaster. If you restart early, you've only lost, 5 minutes? A veteran player of roguelikes gets through a couple of systems in FTL and says, "This is a good run. I found a lot of extra scrap, I found a couple extra crew members, I should ride this one out until the end." Or, more importantly, they might say, "This is a bad run. I didn't get any good drops, I've taken too much damage, I need to start over." That knowledge is the real secret to roguelikes. The art of losing, well, the art of starting over, isn't hard to master. And that brings us to Into the Breach. Into the Breach is a strategy RPG with lots of roguelike elements. It's by the same people who made FTL. Like FTL, it's fairly quick to pick up, the graphics are simple but effective, and the game is really hard. And also like FTL, there's a lot of volatility that comes from procedural generation. The maps are procedurally generated, the enemies are procedurally placed, loot pods crash down onto the battlefield according to an algorithm, and mech pilots, your characters, are subject to permadeath. So, just like in FTL, it's really important to know when to start over. If you start over at the right time, you can actually send one of your mech pilots back in time, so that you get to start the game with that character. If you start over before your chosen pilot dies, that pilot gets to keep his or her experience points and level up perks. So really, knowing when to start over is even more important in Into the Breach than it was in FTL. But here's the problem. It's pretty easy to tear through battles in FTL at a rapid pace. Some battles are harder and take a longer time, but most of them are fairly quick. Much of the combat interface can be automated, and there aren't that many decisions to make in any given situation. Into the Breach is not like that. Into the Breach is a classical, grid-based strategy RPG. Strategy RPGs have a longer history than roguelikes do. In fact, early versions of Dungeons & Dragons were the offspring of a couple of strategy games called Brownstein and Chainmail. But those games took a long time to play. When players got together to play those kinds of RPGs, they would sit around a large table in someone's basement for a whole afternoon, and many times they wouldn't even finish a single battle. Modern video games have shortened the process of playing strategy RPGs. Computers can run all the calculations and roll the dice really quickly. The AI opponents can make quick decisions about what they're going to do, and modern strategy RPGs tend to have fewer characters on the battlefield than their ancestors did. Into the Breach uses all of those techniques to make its battles shorter, but there's not really such a thing as a fast strategy RPG. Playing those battles perfectly, which you really need to do in order to maximize your rewards and minimize your damage, takes a lot of careful consideration. So it's a lot harder to practice losing faster. Intricate strategy RPGs are not really compatible with speedy gameplay. This doesn't make Into the Breach a bad game. It just means that the art of losing, or the art of starting over, is a much longer process, and that can be really frustrating. Certainly, I've bounced off the game every time I've tried to play it, and I really like strategy RPGs, and I really liked FTL. But maybe this game wasn't designed for chumps like me. Maybe it was designed for the original niche audience of roguelikes, people who have put a lot more time and energy into mastering the art of losing. The game design extracts are supported by Patreon. Patreon backers get cool rewards like bonus videos, bonus articles, access to the Game Design Forum Discord, free copies of the books this series was based on, and the ability to vote on the topic of upcoming videos. Right now, backers are voting on the topic of Episode 4. My backers include these kind folks. Thanks for watching.